Welcome to The Flux, where we hear stories from people who've asked what-if questions to better understand the world and talk about how data can help tell stories that impact decisions and create an intentional impact on the future. This is your host, John Cordier, CEO at Epistemics. In a world where the flux capacitor from Back to the Future does not yet exist, people have to make difficult decisions without always knowing how the future will play out. Our guests are people who've taken risks, made decisions when uncertainty was high, and who have assisted decision makers by using data and models. We hope you can turn lessons from our podcast into foresight so you or your organization can make better decisions and create an intentional impact for others. Welcome to the next episode of The Flux. Today's guest is Sam Harbisman, scientist in residence at Lux Capital and research fellow at the Long Now Foundation. I met Sam about 4 years ago, and since then I tell people that Sam has the coolest job on the planet that I've uncovered so far. He basically gets to operate at the intersection of technology, complexity science, venture capital, and through his writing gets to help nudge the world as it's moving forward in a positive direction. I've always been a really big fan and always eager to learn more about what Sam's working on. So Sam, glad to have you on today.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's good to be talking with you, and I appreciate the very kind words.
Absolutely. So with all those different pieces of your background, it was tough to find a lead-in question for you, but between the couple books you've written and then the one that you're working on, the list you put together and your other writing, one of the things I like to start with when bring new guests on is understanding what got you into complex systems or computational social science in the first place. What sparked that interest for you?
Yeah, that is a great question. I don't think there was any specific single spark or kind of inspiration, but I would say there were a number of different through lines or experiences that kind of got me thinking about these kinds of things. So one I would say certainly was playing the computer game SimCity. So my first experience with SimCity was, I think it was the black and white Macintosh version. And then soon after that, eventually got SimCity 2000, which is isometric 3D version, which I view as the most beautiful of all the SimCity versions. And for me, I didn't know anything about city design. I was a little kid. I didn't know anything about city design or any of these details, but being able to not just build a city in a dollhouse way, but build a mini little society or kind of system that actually would bite back. It would actually have all of these feedback loops and processes, and whether or not they were actually realistic, that's an entirely separate question. And I, as someone not involved in city design, I'm probably not well qualified for that. But the fact that I was able to interact and kind of twiddle knobs and lay things down and then see how this kind of emergent system actually would respond to these things, I found incredibly powerful and incredibly exciting. And I remember the actual, I think either the original SimCity manual or maybe the SimCity 2000 manual, it had essays or a bibliography about all these things about city design. And I remember convincing my parents to take me to the local university library to learn about these kinds of things. And I was blown away by this. And so I would say SimCity was certainly one touchstone for kind of me beginning to think about these computational models of social systems, for example. Another touchstone, very different, was reading the Foundation Trilogy by Isaac Asimov. So I was from very early on, I was a huge consumer of lots and lots of science fiction. I used to read a ton of it. My grandfather, he lived to the age of 99, he read science fiction probably since the modern dawn of the genre, and so he would point things out to me, and I think he read Dune when it was serialized in a magazine, and I still have his original Foundation Trilogy copy. So it has the first 3 books, the entire thing is a trilogy, is a single edition, and the exciting thing about the Foundation Trilogy was that there was this idea. Oh, you have it as well. Fantastic. I love it. Yeah.
Right on the bookshelf next to the desk.
I love it. Okay. There you go. Yeah. There was this idea of psychohistory, that there was a scientist, the psychohistorian, Harry Seldon, who was the creator of this domain of knowledge, this kind of branch of science, where the idea behind it was that even though we can't predict specific individual decisions, I can't say, okay, whether or not some politician is going to make this decision, or whether or not run-of-the-mill people will go to work or go home or do whatever. These things are very hard to predict because people are individual and irrational people. They're individuals. But the idea behind psychohistory is that when you have a large enough society, when you put a large enough group of individuals together, then there is some sort of regularity behind how history kind of moves forward. And there are actually ways of creating this kind of quantitative social science. And psychohistory was this embodiment. And the Foundation Trilogy was a lot of fun. I remember enjoying it, but I remember really being struck by this idea of psychohistory. And then due to that, always thinking in the back of my mind, are there real versions of this? Like, it's wonderful that it was this cool science fictional scientific discipline, but could there be actually something real? And it turns out computational social science, it is not actually predicting history in all of its details and kind of the shape of empires and things like that, but it does aim to place bounds on our ignorance or kind of of our uncertainty. And it turns out actually, if you talk to a lot of computational social scientists for long enough, you will find that the Foundation Trilogy was probably some sort of inspiration or kind of touchstone within their own with their own personal and professional trajectory. And so, yeah, so it's not surprising that I too was influenced by that.
Yeah, absolutely. Of my two co-founders, Don, he uses the Foundation Trilogy as his inspiration.
Okay, that's fantastic.
And what got him bought into agent-based simulation in the first place.
Oh yeah, and actually, I remember very early on, like when I was reading the Foundation Trilogy, this was the early days of the internet, and I remember searching for if anyone had written anything about psychohistory, and I think at the time all I could find was about certain branches of like psychoanalysis or something around psychology, like that had a similar term, and I was really disappointed. But I do remember, though, I think there was someone who wrote an essay in the Analog Science Fiction Fact magazine. So in addition to publishing science fiction short stories and novellas and things like that, they actually would occasionally, and I think like every issue would have one or two more science fact essays. And one of them was about psychohistory and whether or not there are these kind of more realistic things. And then, but I'm sure between my interest in that, between my interest in SimCity, I began to learn about the entire sort of world of complexity science, the world around the Santa Fe Institute and kind of agent-based modeling and ideas around emergence. And that got me very interested in kind of all these different sorts of topics and realizing, oh, there actually is an intellectual framework undergirding all of these interesting ideas that up until that point I thought were just either fun games or science fiction. Like there is actually some real meat here. And that was what got me excited by it.
At one point, SimCity had something like 40 million active players.
Wow. Okay.
Like over a period of time. Amazing. And when you look at somewhat with your like innovation hat on, somewhat with your venture capital hat on, do you see a science fiction trend or a video game then lead to, all right, now this can become actually real? Like, do you have examples of where you've seen that in the past, or do you see that as a story arc of the inspiration for some companies?
In some cases, maybe not companies, but certainly certain types of products. And I would caveat this a lot. I would say many science fiction writers, they would not say that they're in the business of predicting the future. They're often trying to talk about our current moment with a series of thought experiments, or they're creating like a series of what ifs about the world and then extrapolating outwards. They're not necessarily saying this is the way the world will actually go. That being said, there are many instances where science fiction stories have actually been the inspiration for people who are actually trying to build things in the real world. In fact, so Arizona State University has a center called the Center for Science and the Imagination, and one of the things they're involved with is thinking about how to get scientists and engineers to engage with science fiction writers to get all of them to be as creative and imaginative as possible. And so it turns out that I believe that there's evidence that the first flip phone, I think it was like the track phone, the Motorola StarTAC phone. I forgot the exact name, but the first flip phone by Motorola was inspired by the communicator from the original Star Trek. And in fact, if you look at like Star Trek Next Generation, they're all holding all these pads, these kind of like notepad devices that feel eerily similar to an iPad. And you can see that if you look at Minority Report, I think Steven Spielberg, before he made the movie, actually got a lot of different writers and thinkers and futurists together. I don't know if any science fiction writers were involved, but beginning to think about, extrapolating what the future might look like. And some of those interfaces or technologies have become real. I don't necessarily think because people watched Minority Report and were immediately inspired. That being said, though, I think there is this feedback where many people who are interested in science and engineering and technology grew up reading science fiction, And we're very excited to make these things a reality. And actually, and within Lux, one of the things we always talk about is this idea of like bridging the gap between science fact and science fiction. Kind of like, how do you actually make these things a reality? And we are very interested in finding people who are thinking about those kinds of things and looking at, and sometimes using these things as either as a blueprint or inspiration. One of the things that I find also very powerful about science fiction and these stories is that when you want to think about the implications of a technology or a scientific advance, oftentimes when people think about, oh, like, what will this new technology be like, this futuristic technology, we often think about it in terms of whiz-bang gadgetry. But the truth is, that's not what a new technology will do. We often have to think about the societal, regulatory, legal, ethical implications of all these things. And science fiction is actually really good at doing that and saying, okay, when this technology is not brand new, but when everyone has it, when it's embedded in society and is all like old and gritty in the way like, I don't know, Star Wars technologies are often messed up and dusty or rusted. What will the world look like then when it's not like shiny and new, when everyone has it? What will that mean for society, and how can we think about that kind of thing? And science fiction is particularly good at that. And I think it's really good at running these thought experiments, helping us think through, is this the kind of future that we want to build? Because I think obviously there's many dystopian stories, and so I certainly don't want to build those, and I'm hoping many people don't want to do that as well. But I do think that science fiction can maybe provide us like a suite of possibilities and a menu of ways in like kind of, I don't know, North Stars with which we can aim towards.
Yeah, we got introduced by one of our mutually favorite near-term sci-fi novelist, Elliot Pepper. So
he's fantastic.
Absolutely. And Elliot was also who first introduced me to the Long Now Foundation. So where do you see like counterfactuals, or who are some of the groups that you've encountered that do those exceptionally well with a positive North Star rather than a dystopian North Star?
Yeah, I would hope that everyone does it positively. When I think about the Long Now Foundation, I'm very interested in sort of the ideas around how do we think about these very long-term futures, because it is very easy to get stuck in kind of our moment by moment life, or kind of quarter by quarter sort of corporate cycles. And it's important to think very long term. Now, whether those long-term visions will come to pass, I think is separate from just the very act of expanding our imagination and saying, okay, let's stretch that a little bit and think not just a few months or a few years in the future, but a decade, a century, a millennium, even further. The act of doing that, I think, can be really insightful, especially when you're going like way far out. One, in some ways, almost anything is possible. But at the same time, though, it's also very powerful because it gets us to think about things around the language change, geopolitics, I don't know, material science, which is one of the reasons why the Long Now Foundation is trying to build this clock designed to last for 10,000 years. In the course of doing that, you will think through all these things, hopefully well. Now, in terms of what are the organizations or individuals that are thinking about these kinds of things very well, the truth is there's probably pockets of these people all over. For me, I just want there to be more of these people grappling with this kind of like massive time horizon. And I will admit, I don't necessarily think I have a great track record with predicting what the future will be like. But I think in the act of trying to predict the future, what you're trying to do is often find these hints of the future that are already around. In the same way that the famous William Gibson quote of the future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed. I mean, there are already these hints of the future, in addition to long-term population trends and things like that. And so being able to identify these little hints and say, okay, what would happen if we scaled them up or made them more of a reality or made them more distributed? I think these kinds of things can be very powerful. And I think venture capital is one of these mechanisms for helping catalyze these kind of positive visions of the future. Because venture capital, and we're not the ones necessarily building these innovations and creating them ourselves, we are almost acting as like intellectual midwives to make these things hopefully more possible. And so I would actually say that to a certain degree, that is the role of venture capital and like similar kinds of industries, where we are trying to identify these hints of a potential positive future and then try to make them more of a reality in the future.
Has that changed? If you've been with Lux for 9 or so years now, have you seen venture capital start shifting to look at more long-term, or like pockets of venture capital, look at more longer-term type challenges rather than, oh, we need to fit this into a 5-year, 7-year, look at what's going on quarter by quarter? How's that changed in in your experience so
Yeah, I would
far?
say, and over the time that I've been with Lux, certainly the kind of what is referred to as like deep tech or frontier tech or emerging tech. It's really kind of anything that has a more kind of hard science basis. Or I would say the kind of the more fun way to describe it is anything that feels a little bit like science fiction. Those are the kind of things that Lux has been thinking about, right, for many years, for decades. But probably since I've been at Lux, I have noticed a lot of other venture firms beginning to play in these spaces, which I think is a good change because it shows that, and yeah, we're not focusing on just like, I don't know, the app of the month or some specific software innovation, which I mean, those are still very important, but being willing to say, okay, not only are you technologists being lauded for trying to tackle some very hard problem, but we are going to invest in you to try to actually make that kind of hard problem solved. And I think that is actually a really exciting change. That being said, I would say another interesting change that's happened over the past several years is that people are beginning to also realize that there should be a greater suite of options for how people do cutting edge scientific and technological research. And so the way I think about this is, I mean, historically, if you wanted to do cutting edge research, there were a few choices for like institutional forms. You could do it in a university, you could do it within a corporate industry lab, you can maybe try to build some sort of startup around that kind of thing. But the truth is, those are just 3 points in some weird high dimensional space of potential institutional forms. And over the past few years, a number of new forms have been proposed, new types of organizations have been created, for profit, nonprofit, distributed, remote, or is it distributed or in person, some that are focused around specific problems, some focused around just giving money to top notch people and saying, okay, here you have a decade's worth of funding or whatever it is to go solve things. And I love this kind of this blooming of new types of ways of getting people to solve these cutting edge problems, because lots of different types of scientific research are not necessarily able to be done within these like specific kind of traditional modes. The way I also think about it is, I mean, there are a huge number of activities that are valuable for science moving forward, but only a small subset of those things are actually valued by scientific academia in terms of here's the things you need to do to get tenure versus here's all the things that are actually really important for science and kind of technological innovation. And creating new places where people can do those kinds of things is actually a really important mechanism for making those kinds of emerging tech kind of positive visions of kind of the scientific innovation future more likely.
So one of the questions we like to ask people, and this is riffing on the forward-looking nature of things, if you were to rewind in your lifetime some decisions that you were privy to, and let's say you had a flux capacitor like in Back to the Future, and could go back to a moment that you might now consider a what the flux kind of moment, like what were you thinking? What were we thinking as an org? Doesn't have to be a more personal thing, or could be more of like a societal decision that was made. If you could go back to that and look at that what the flux moment and look at it differently, what other information do you wish you would have had, or do you think those decision makers should have had, or how do you think if people better understood emergence and the complex systems approach, what would be one of those decisions that you would rewind the clock and go back to help be more informed about today?
That's a really good question. Nothing immediately comes to mind, but I would say kind of the overarching sort of way I think about certain aspects of decision making, especially within complex systems, is just the fact that we often, as we build a more and more sophisticated model, we sometimes mistake reality for the model itself versus realizing, okay, this is verisimilitudinous. It looks like reality. It can be very informative, but it is not actually reality. And having a certain amount of humility when we use these sort of computational models or mathematical models to think about not highly nonlinear complex systems, they can be informative and certainly place bounds on our uncertainty and kind of what we don't know and help us make better decisions. But to confuse the model with reality, I think can be very worrying. Now, in terms of specific examples for that, I unfortunately do not have any like immediately that come to mind. I'm sure there are many, and I'm sure there are many that have not necessarily even been publicized, because I imagine like decision makers or organizations and companies don't necessarily want to publicize the fact that, oh yeah, we thought we mistook the model for reality, or we had this wonderful spreadsheet and we discovered, oh wait, this spreadsheet is actually not the real world. But I am sure there are countless of those kinds of examples.
When you think of counterfactuals and how you've seen organizations use those to think through some of these complex challenges. Have you seen that evolve over time, or where do you think even just the practice of, could be scenario planning, it could be like running through simulations to understand different counterfactual scenarios, like how do you see that being used in the future? And are there use cases that, if you said I haven't seen it yet, but if in politics this was used, if in medicine this was used, if in aerospace this was used, here's where you would pinpoint a couple of really good use cases?
Yeah, and so I'm a big fan of counterfactuals, especially the story versions of them, like the whole alternate history realm. I love them. A lot of them are, when it comes to the story counterfactuals, they're often limited by the fact that they have to ring true and often have to rhyme with the way history kind of played out. Now, when it comes to counterfactuals for scenario planning, things like that, they don't necessarily have to do that. But I do think, though, we're often hamstrung by our limitations in thinking about what these counterfactuals and scenarios are. I would say that when I think about these kind of counterfactuals, oftentimes we can, and there's many people who talk about this, there's often a conflation between whether or not the outcome was good with whether or not the decision-making process was good. Because you can have a good decision-making process, but it can lead to an unsuccessful outcome. And you can also have a really bad decision-making process, and then it ends up leading to a good outcome. And the latter, of having a bad process but leading to a good outcome, that's just luck. That's not something that should be, and maybe it's repeatable, maybe it'll happen multiple times, but that's not a repeatable process. On the other hand, as long as you have a process that after the fact feels good, like where you can say, okay, even in the absence of these things going correctly, or even though things did not go well, we had the right decision-making process, then like we can be proud of it no matter the outcome. I think that's the proper way of thinking about these kind of counterfactuals, because there's many instances in like the corporate world where a company makes a big bet and it works out very well, or they make a big bet and it does not work out well. And the question becomes, okay, was that big bet on some new technology or some new idea or some new product, was that made with the best kind of information? Did we really understand where the world was in that moment in order to make that decision? And if you did, but it still didn't work out well, I think that's fine. And so I definitely think like that kind of thinking, especially imposed on kind of the scenario planning kind of approach, can be very powerful, because oftentimes when people are trying to think about how to make decisions or what the future will be like, even in a relatively short amount of time, we're very limited in our imagination. And so creating a set of scenarios or even like a series of what ifs helps us expand what we think the world might look like, and then therefore helps us figure out, okay, how robust will our decisions be under all these scenarios or under things that we can't predict. And people are trying to not only think about in terms of scenarios, but also in terms of things around like prediction markets and forecasting, because ideally you should, and people have actually talked about this, like combining them, because you want to have multiple different scenarios, but each scenario is not necessarily going to be equally probable. And so combining certain elements of forecasting and maybe using prediction markets with these different scenarios that you're laying out, and then saying, okay, how can we make decisions that allow us to be as robust as possible to the different scenarios and the unknowns that we're going to have to contend with? I think that can be very powerful. Now, in terms of how to do that, I would say certainly things in the policymaking world could be very powerful, and certainly things in how we think about, I don't know, aerospace could be relevant. Medicine. The truth is, like, anytime you're tasked with making large-scale decisions under uncertainty, you should have ways of narrowing down your uncertainty. And if you don't, then you're just making stuff up, and that's not great.
One of the people involved with Epistemics, he talks about whether it was a good decision, bad decision, the decision was made, and then at a certain point, it just comes down to execution and how much conviction you can get behind that decision. So let's say from the process that you just described, there's good process, decision is made, but then from the decision being made to things getting implemented or executed or being able to adjust that from that decision point forward, have you seen any tools or things that have been really useful from decision making into storytelling to build conviction to give that decision a greater likelihood of success?
I have not. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not sure of a good answer for that. Oh, and actually, I can add one thing related to the what the flux sort of moment. One thing I would say is certainly, I would say, not necessarily decisions, but the ways in which people thought about certain things around the pandemic, especially early on, just the fact that our intuition doesn't deal well with nonlinear phenomena, I would say that is certainly one aspect of kind of how a lot of people, not necessarily experts, but a lot of people, like our intuitions failed us in terms of how we thought these kinds of things operated. And simulations and modeling can and obviously help anchor these kinds of things much more powerfully.
Within the complexity science or even venture capital related to more deeper technologies, are there some common beliefs that you think we're getting wrong from an intuition perspective, or that like industry is moving in this way, but you or Lux or Long Now thinks very differently about?
Yeah, I would say certain things around technological complexity, I feel like we have not quite internalized as a society the extent to which our technologies are not only highly complex nonlinear systems, but also increasingly incomprehensible even for the people who either built these systems or kind of deal with them on a daily basis. And so this is kind of part of the premise of my second book, Overcomplicated, but the idea that we are enmeshed in these massively complex systems that and to kind of undergird our world, whether it's like things around utilities or infrastructure, data centers. These things are all, they almost have some sort of like almost like organic level of complexity. And I wouldn't quite, obviously biology is very complex, but these things are becoming so complex that you almost have to think about them and use similar kinds of biological techniques to grapple with them and understand them. And certainly some experts have thought about these kinds of things. But I would say certainly when it comes to just the average person, and even like some technologists, like there is just this lack of understanding with like how unbelievably complicated some of these systems are. And we see hints, and with AI, and obviously people are beginning to realize, okay, these things are actually gigantically complex and sophisticated and not necessarily understandable. And we have to just like interrogate them versus versus saying, oh, they're engineered systems and therefore we should be able to understand everything. And the answer is no, that is not how it works anymore. And so beginning to almost use biological techniques or techniques informed from complexity science to actually deal with the complex technologies we ourselves have actually created, I think is going to be a increasingly important paradigm as we just deal with the world that we live in. And actually, so the computer scientist Danny Hillis, he has this way of describing it, that we've moved from the Enlightenment, this kind of era when we could apply our rationality to the world around us to understand it, to the entanglement, where everything is just so hopelessly entangled and connected together, we can't fully understand it. Now, of course, we should still try, and it should not be, okay, we should not either have a state of total ignorance or a state of total understanding. We can have partial understanding, and that's still very important, but it's much better to try to understand these systems at least partly, rather than assume that they are completely understood and then just be blindsided by these massive levels of complexity. When airlines fail or when the stock market goes down for a little while and we're just like blindsided about, oh wait, these things were actually highly nonlinear and highly complex in a way that we had not realized.
I remember reading a few of your articles about those topics, and this might be a good plug-in for the third book. Is there a hint of what your third book is about? Is it bringing in any of these like biological emergence AI type things, or how our information or knowledge changes over time? Like, where's the third book going?
So my first book, The Half-Life of Facts, was about how to understand changing knowledge. The second book was about understanding incomprehensible technology, Overcomplicated. And I guess the third one is a somewhat different take on like how we think about like the epistemology of technology. In this case, it's about the wonders and weirdness of computing and computation, very broadly construed. The idea is that if you take the idea of computing and computation seriously, it's not just going to provide insight into engineering, which, though it does, it should also, in the course of thinking about it and taking it seriously, help you think better about language and philosophy and biology, going back to emergence and biological ideas, certain ideas around reality. And I almost kind of view computing and computation as akin to almost like a liberal art, where like when you take it seriously, it swirls around and draws together all these other different ideas. And of course, artificial intelligence plays a big role here, makes a big appearance. But I definitely think when we think about these domains and relate to like what you're talking about in terms of complex systems, that when you take not only just kind of complex systems seriously, but the complex system of knowledge and what we know, there is, to quote E.O. Wilson, like there's a certain amount of consilience. Like these things are all interconnected and swirling together. And so therefore, when you think about computing, you should also be thinking about ancient Greek mythology or storytelling or ideas from the Talmud or the Bible. Like these things are all actually connected because to a certain degree, everything is connected, which of course sounds a little bit like vapid and like there's not much else. But I do think that if you take these ideas seriously, there should be lots of different connections, recognizing, yeah, the ways in which computer science and computation and technology are increasingly coming together with certain ideas in biology, or the ways in which we think about building life in silico. What does that mean? What is this idea of artificial life? Or how do we think about the entire realm of simulation? Because simulation should also bear on how we think about reality and the complexity and nonlinearity of the world around us. And so there's a lot there about kind of how do we think about humility and modeling and all these different kinds of things. And yeah, so the third one is trying to think about all these different topics and provide a more humanistic approach to thinking about computing.
Earlier on in the conversation, we talked about hoping that there are more people that can think in a way of complexity and scenarios and the like, and just having more people who are able to do that. I also share the view that would make the world a better place because we're being more thoughtful about some of the decisions that we're making and the like. If you had to guide somebody through getting into that type of thought or fields of study in school, whether that's in as early as middle school or as late as a PhD program, where do you recommend people start?
The one interesting thing around complexity science and complex systems is that, and obviously the kind of mathematics and the scientific ideas around them are sophisticated and actually they can require years and years of study. But understanding the nonlinearity of our world, or kind of just the ways in which individual agents, when they interact, can create sort of emergent behaviors that might be counterintuitive to a naive user. These kinds of things, you can play with these things very easily. There are computer models on the web, and you could download software that does these kinds of things. And so I actually think that we're in this golden age of the availability of these tools to provide people with an intuition. So in the same way that I mentioned how SimCity it allowed me to see a little bit of what it's like to interact and engage with a complex nonlinear system. There are many even like simpler versions of these kinds of things, whether it's like understanding like a model of a forest fire or how birds flock together or whatever it is, looking at the ways in which these simple rules will allow this emergent behavior to occur, as well as just playing with the parameters and playing with these different things, I think is super, super exciting and also incredibly accessible. So I actually think that we should be teaching these kinds of ideas earlier and in almost like a disciplinarily agnostic sort of way, because it should be available. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that like everyone should be studying complexity science at some high level, but everyone should have some sort of experience as well as some sort of intuition around these kinds of ideas, because they are just as fundamental as understanding things around certain idea, like F equals MA or whatever it is. Like these are like, we live in a very complex and highly nonlinear world, and it's great that we can we can learn calculus to solve certain types of differential equations. But the truth is, the solvable differential equations are they are far simpler than the complexity and messiness of the world. And so we need to kind of recognize that we're already living in this world. And so it's just important for people to see the ways in which we are, and the ways in which, even though we are in this complex world, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are therefore in a state of ignorance. There are ways of creating handles and understanding, and even these simple models can provide that kind of.
Yeah. One of the things that we think through is, if you look at computer science education, it's now gone down into elementary schools, middle schools, certainly high schools. It's much more common, at least in the United States. And if you look at the field of machine learning, 20 years ago, it's not like there were a whole bunch of machine learning graduate school programs. Now you're going to just about any school and it's being offered. And so in some ways, there's these waves of trends that pick up steam.
I was going to say, so related to Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz, they invented, they developed the calculus, and it was obviously very cutting edge at one point. But now we teach it in high school and universities, and the fact that we can democratize that sort of knowledge is great, and we should keep on doing that kind of thing, finding ways of democratizing it. And actually, one of the things I think about in terms of ways of doing that would almost be, so there was this great piece of software that was released in relatively early Macintosh, late 80s, early 90s, known as HyperCard, where it was almost like a tool for building almost proto web pages that lived on your own computer where you could drag and drop buttons and images and you could draw things. But it also under the hood had lots of different kind of programming tools. And so you could easily build fairly sophisticated software. And so like the game Myst, I think, was actually first developed within HyperCard. And one of the things I've thought about was like, could we build almost like a HyperCard, but for simulation, like a tool that kind of has the well-known phrase of Seymour Papert, like the low floors but high ceilings, like ways of allowing the threshold, like a very low threshold for allowing people to build things, but still also allowing for a great deal of sophistication in building simulations. And I would love it if like we had more tools for that kind of thing where people could easily kind of wire up very simple simulations or models. And you see this with NetLogo and some other kinds of things. I'm sure you guys are working on this kind of thing as well. But then also, okay, here's a simple model, but then now let's add a little bit more sophistication and a little bit more and a little bit more. And suddenly you're actually trying to actually build a fairly complicated thing, which can then provide some intuition about a much more realistic and complex system. And we need more of those. And so I think about the HyperCard for simulation. And there are other people who talk about these kinds of things as well. But yeah, I find that idea enormously exciting.
Awesome. With that, one final question: of all of the different things that you've been able to look at in the last year, what are some of the things that make you most optimistic about the field of simulation, or where the field of maybe computational sociology or some others might be going?
Huge amounts of computing resources are just newly available for everyone, that it means that things that would have just been impossible or very difficult 5 years, 10 years ago, or even further, are now democratized. And I certainly think we need better interfaces, better tools, and better kind of software. But just the fact that we have so much computing power at our disposal gives me a great deal of optimism for just like this is the platform upon which all these different applications and ideas and things I can't even imagine are going to be possible. And so that's super exciting.